Welcome back to UC Davis Live. I'm Satirius Johnson. The Russian invasion of Ukraine represents a return of warfare to Europe on a scale not seen since the 1940s. What motivated Russian President Vladimir Putin to mount the invasion, and why now? What's the historical context behind the relationship between Russia and Ukraine? And what roles are the media playing in the conflict? Joining us to discuss these issues are three experts from UC Davis. Josephine Andrews is Associate Professor of Political Science. She studies executive power, executive structures, and how they affect government and democracy in Central and Eastern European countries. Ian Campbell is an Associate Professor of History. He studies the relationship between non-Russian subjects and territories and the imperial core of pre-revolutionary Russia. And Jenny Kaminer is an Associate Professor in the Department of German and Russian. She's an interdisciplinary scholar of contemporary Russian culture. Her most recent book, Haunted Dreams, Fantasies of Adolescence in Post-Soviet Culture, was just published by Cornell University Press. Thank you all for coming on today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be here.
And if you're watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comments section and we will work in as many as we can. So Josephine, let's start with you. The Russian president has publicly made some claims about why he ordered the invasion. Or what he's calling a special military operation. What are his justifications, and are Putin's real motivations different from what he's publicly saying?
Yeah, so his justifications, there are two major justifications. The first, I think, that's been around for quite some time, since the end of the Cold War, is the continued expansion of NATO. And certainly he became president in 2000, and that was an issue that he began raising then. And he's raised it in more serious and strident tones as the years have gone by. And certainly it's true, NATO has expanded. The other reason that he gave, which actually harkens back to the 2014 reasoning for the annexation of Crimea, the supporting of the separatists in Eastern Ukraine, is the need to protect ethnic Russian speakers in Ukraine from a government that doesn't have their best interests at heart and may even be wanting to harm them. So those are his two main reasons that he's verbalized publicly. And those echo things he said over the past 8 years, certainly since the 2014 actions in Ukraine. And then to follow up on why now, I think there's some other reasons, though, that help explain why this is happening now. Certainly he is concerned about NATO expansion, but NATO expansion has been going on since the late 1990s. And the recent countries to join really were never part of the Soviet Union's and therefore Russia's sphere of influence. So they weren't, so the real expansion began, the threatening expansion ended in 2004. So I think there's other reasons why he's beginning now. And would you like me to elaborate those on now, or?
Well, okay. So the expansion of NATO was one of his stated claims. The other one is the protecting of the Russian-speaking minority. Has there been any evidence that the Russian-speaking minority, needed protecting?
No, there's no evidence that there is any kind of government-sponsored effort to harm native Russian speakers at all. In fact, many Ukrainians speak fluent Ukrainian, fluent Russian. This is a country that has had native Russian speakers for generations. So, and so there really doesn't seem to be any specific incidents that we can point to. There is, of course, a conflict. There was a conflict in 2014 in a civil war, but that really began because of Russia's support for the insurgents in that area.
Yeah, right, and I would just underline something that Professor Andrews has said. There's a real conflation in the way that Putin talks about this between speaking Russian as a first language on one hand and identification with Russian ethnicity or the Russian nation as opposed to Ukraine. And this is not something which is actually the case, particularly in urban areas, particularly in areas that experienced heavy Soviet influence in the East. Many people who were ethnically Ukrainian would have spoken Russian as a first language, just as a matter of course, while still feeling themselves to be Ukrainian and identifying more with that ethnicity in that nation.
Right. And then so as far as the NATO expansion part of it, how legitimate do you think that claim is, that Russia is threatened strategically, militarily, and otherwise, should Ukraine at some point in the future, join NATO?
Well, I think it is a legitimate concern of Russia, certainly. And President Yeltsin in the 1990s was concerned about NATO's plans to continue. That's definitely a legitimate security concern. And a lot of experts question whether that was wise for NATO to continue or not. But I think what's really the reality today is NATO did continue. And so is it a security concern? It is a legitimate security concern, but is it an immediate threat to Russia? I think that's certainly not the case. It's not shown any evidence that there was any immediate threat to Russia's integrity in any dimension, actually.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there might be, of course, other ways to deal with those concerns other than an invasion, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So why is he taking this action now? And are his what are his real motivations if the public ones aren't necessarily, solid?
Well, I think you can think of, he had some strategic things that he wanted to accomplish. I think he was concerned about some domestic developments in Ukraine. So in the elections after the 2014 events that I've alluded to briefly, Ukrainian public opinion has become more and more pro-Europe and more pro-EU membership. So in the last presidential election and parliamentary elections in 2019, overwhelmingly people supported these pro-EU parties. And the two candidates who were in the runoff for president were both pro-EU candidates. So that's a real shift. That's a huge shift from 2010, for example. And this, of course, has just exacerbated that. So Ukrainians have even a stronger sense of European identity today than they did. And then domestically, Putin has really consolidated his power over the last 2 to 3 years. In 2020, there was a very important constitutional amendment to allow him to serve 2 more terms. So he could, in theory, serve until 2036 now. And the reason that passed just speaks to the incredible concentration of power that his party, United Russia, has throughout the regions, and then the concentration of power in the presidency in Moscow. So I think he feels that domestically he's safe, or he thought domestically, the pushback that he expected to experience, the sanctions, maybe some public opinion public opinion changes, he felt he could easily tolerate that. I think that the events in Belarus were also really important. So there were huge protests that began in, I think, the spring of 2020 with regard to their dictator, President Lukashenko, and then what was clearly a fraudulent election in August. And then after that, the protests continued. And so Lukashenko turned to Russia for support, for financial and military support. And that gave Russia an opening to bring military weaponry, et cetera. And I think it provided the mechanism to have Russian troops positioned along the northern border of Ukraine. And so that was a helpful thing as well. And I think really important to put out there is, I think there's a lot of evidence from many, many experts that Putin really believed the West was weak. And the time to strike was now, if he really wanted to stop Ukraine from joining NATO ever and to secure the territory along the west of Europe, for the future. Europe is divided. Each European nation trades to some extent with Russia, and many are very dependent on Russian fuel, Russian gas, Russian oil. And so he thought that Europe couldn't come together because it would be too costly for them. And we read about that in the media all the time now. But I think he also thought the US was very weak, was divided, was fragmented, was a nation in decline. That kind of rhetoric has been in the amongst the elite, the political elite in Russia for a long time now, for years. So I think all those things work together to help explain why now.
Ian, I was wondering if you could give us a little more of the historical background of this conflict and Russia's claim over Ukraine.
All right, certainly. So this is, I should say from the beginning that this is a kind of an awkward thing to talk about because the kinds of historical claims that Putin and those around him are making about the relationship of Russia to Ukraine are so spurious and contain at most just a homeopathic dose of truth that even debating them, kind of talking about them, I want to be careful not to grant any more legitimacy to them than they have.
Which you don't want to elevate them to like a, I understand. But
so precisely. So, I mean, you can, if you want, take the question of the relationship of Russia and Ukraine all the way back fully a millennium, back to the founding of Kievan Rus, and then a kind of a controversy over whether Ukraine or Muscovy, Russia, was properly the successor of Kievan Rus. To avoid getting too far into the weeds with that, what I would say basically is that the kind of claims that Putin is making, which is basically that Ukraine doesn't have its own nationhood, its own statehood, that this is an artificial kind of construction that lacks its own legitimacy, rests on one very particular understanding of the past that doesn't bear much relationship to reality. The only way that this idea makes sense is that if there's kind of an unbroken line of Russian statehood that goes from Kievan Rus through Muscovy, through the formation of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and the idea that all of these things are at their core fundamentally Russian things, and the existence of other national or ethnic groups is inherently subordinate and incidental. But this is not the case, particularly if we get a little more in the near past now. The Russian Empire was always, highly multi-ethnic polity. Its ruling elite was not only ethnic Russian. The Tsars were, of course, but the other members of the ruling elite were not. The areas of Ukraine to which Putin has been staking the most aggressive claims in the east, in the Donbass, were deeply multi-ethnic, multilingual places. Donetsk, for example, which is in the site of great contention, was founded as Yuzovka, founded by a Welsh industrialist, and became this kind of multi-ethnic industrial city. Soviet Union, although in practice dominated by the interests of the Russian Republic, was actually a multi-ethnic polity where different national republics were meant to have equal rights, and where local languages and local officials were promoted precisely as a means of kind of working as a better kind of transmission belt for communist ideas. The other thing to say about this briefly is that Ukraine, as it appears on the map right now, none of that has kind of a single uniform past in terms of its relationship to the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, which is to say, much of Western Ukraine was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or prior to that, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Much of Western Ukraine only becomes part of the Soviet Union during and after World War II. Ukraine, during the period of the Russian Civil War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is a deeply contested space with kind of multiple kind of statelets, pretendants for power, that only gradually gets brought back into the Soviet fold, and then becomes an object of Soviet nationalities policy, which both promotes the Russian language in practice, but also strongly promotes local interests at the local level, local language use, local cadres as a means of transmitting communist ideology.
So you're basically saying that these kind of arguments that there's some sort of historical reason that Ukraine, is a part of actually Russia, it isn't its own country, all these things, they don't really hold any water.
They don't hold any water. They are profound oversimplifications with at most a tiny grain of truth in them that makes them that much more dangerous. But they're vastly exaggerated. Right.
What about the Crimea region?
So Crimea is a very tricky case. Crimea actually, Crimea becomes part of the Russian Empire after being, the Crimean Khanate, and it's home initially of a Crimean Tatar population. It gains this kind of great resonance in the Russian Empire because of the Crimean War, and it maintains that status, throughout the Soviet period as well. Sevastopol is a hero city of the Soviet Union for its defense against the Nazis. and it becomes more and more Russian, ethnic Russian, in part because of the movement of Russian people to Crimea, in part because of the effects of World War II, specifically Stalinist population engineering the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from the Crimean Peninsula to elsewhere in the Soviet Union, because of a fear that they would be essentially a fifth column in World War II. So Crimea was the one part of Ukraine prior to 2014 that had an ethnic Russian majority in it. And in part, this is a legacy of that kind of Stalinist population engineering. It has that strong kind of cultural resonance in contemporary Russia as well, much stronger than I would say that the Donbass does.
Just to say something quickly, the whole Eastern European region has had very fluid borders for a very, very long time. And so to claim, so just to support Professor Campbell's very great argument about the somewhat ridiculous claims that Putin has made about Ukrainians and Ukraine.
Right. Again, for those watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. Jenny, how has Putin's rule changed over the past 20 years?
So Putin came to power in 2000, and I think we can understand the first or so 8 years of his rule as something like a high point for ordinary Russians. They were able to attain a much higher standard of living than had been possible for them, really probably at any other point in kind of the cumulative total of imperial Russian and Soviet history. They were able to purchase consumer goods. They were able to take vacations to Cyprus and Turkey and other favored locations like that. And that ability to attain a higher standard of living was, predicated upon Putin, or at least his argument was his claim for political legitimacy with the Russian people was that he was able to neutralize the chaos that ensued during the first post-Soviet decade. So the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And I think sometimes, we in the West like to imagine that was a story that had a happy ending. They were able, we gave them democracy and they lived happily ever after. But the 90s for the majority of Russians were characterized by scarcity, by poverty, in addition to this, kind of large psychic weight that accompanied the perceived humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the end of their superpower status. So Putin came to power in 2000 and said, stick with me, and you can enjoy these, this newfound standard of living. The Russian GDP rebounded from, where it had absolutely bottomed out in the 1990s. But the tacit social contract that accompanied that was that ordinary Russians would accept or not notice or turn away from the increasingly repressive measures that accompanied Putin's ascension to power. So, for example, not to get too wonky, but he consolidated power by, for example, taking away elections from the regional governorships. Those were appointed as opposed to being elected. There's a lot of conversation now about censorship of Russian media and the inability of independent voices to be heard in the contemporary Russian media landscape. But one of Putin's first acts after he assumed power in 2000 was to orchestrate the takeover of one of the most popular independent television channels from the 1990s, NTV. And not coincidentally, I would argue, NTV had on the air a satirical puppet show. And one of those puppets was a puppet version of Putin that was, as we can imagine, not too flattering. And soon after NTV was put in more Putin-friendly hands, that puppet show conveniently disappeared. So I would argue that what we have been observing in Russia represents an intensification of processes that began very early on after Putin's ascension to power. I would argue the first signs that implicit social contract with Russians, improved standard of living, middle class lifestyle in exchange for turning away from what is happening in the political sphere. The first signs that tacit contract was fraying, we can observe in the wave of protests that broke out in Moscow between 2011 and 2013. And a cynical interpretation of the invasion of Crimea in 2014 would propose that as an invasion motivated as much by internal factors and an attempt to rally the Russian people around Putin, to get them, back into the fold, to get them to agree once again to that social contract that had characterized the first 8 years of Putin's rule. And really, since 2014, and even more intensively since 2017, 2018, we have seen an erosion of independent media. We have seen crackdown on opposition movements. One well-known case would be the opposition activist, whom probably many might be, the one opposition activist from Russia whom we might be familiar with, Alexei Navalny. So he's been active in the opposition movement for, at this point, 10 to 12 years. And before 2020, he had spent quite a few nights in Russian prisons. He had been brought up on charges of, very specious charges of embezzling money, but he had never been physically targeted. And in 2020, he was poisoned, by all accounts, by Russian security services. He was flown to Germany, received medical treatment there, but very bravely decided to come back to Russia, where he was promptly arrested, and he's now serving out a prison term in a Russian penal colony. And as contemporaneous with the invasion of Ukraine, Navalny has been tried once again for a number of different charges. So there's currently a trial of Navalny happening in the prison colony where he's being held, which is highly irregular. And as the invasion of Ukraine has been unfolding, his trial has also been continuing. And if he is convicted again, that will extend his sentence to 15 years. So, and in addition to the repression of Navalny as an individual, his entire network of anti-corruption, the offices that comprise his anti-corruption organization, that, he had a quite vast network across the territory of the Russian Federation. Those have all been shut down and liquidated and neutralized.
Mm-hmm. So he's basically consolidated his power over the last couple of decades, and now is in a position, he feels, to invade Ukraine.
Yes,
right.
I think he has made any dissent. It has become so difficult to be a voice of dissent, difficult, if not impossible, in Russia today. Just within the last few weeks, you've seen, for example, a law passed that if you refer to the war in Ukraine as a war, as opposed to a special military operation, which is what it is officially known as, that can be punishable by up to 15 years in prison. So when we do read about the Russians who have been out on the streets protesting, there's something like 13,000 Russians, I believe, who've been arrested since the beginning of the war. We have to really understand how brave of a decision that was.
Yeah, and I would add that he's so attempted to hollow out civil society to sources of dissenting opinion on political alternatives. So he's so isolated himself that it appears as though it was very difficult to present any kind of alternative view of what might happen if the invasion took place. I mean, many of us will have seen even the kind of the meetings preceding the invasion, the kind of almost ritual humiliation of his closest ministers, really kind of demonstrating who's in charge here. It's not time to express an alternative.
And I think that all of the things that Professor Kaminer said are the reasons, I think. So that took a long time to put all that, to really concentrate the control over the information space in Russia. And I think that's why he felt that he could withstand any kind of domestic pushback on this invasion.
Well, it's almost surprising that 1,300 demonstrators were arrested, because Putin has clamped down so hard on the media and the narrative, and making sure that people were only hearing his narrative. So what are the Russian people hearing about the conflict at this point?
I think if you turn on any of the official state media outlets, whether they be TV or print or internet, They are conspicuous for what is absent. There are no mentions of civilian casualties. It is being presented to the Russian people exclusively as a military operation targeting military infrastructure. They are shown photos of the happy citizens of residents of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region, greeting the Russian soldiers as liberators. In fact, I was just scrolling through the newsfeed of Channel One of the Russian state television stations, their website, and they were including these photos of the happily liberated residents of Donbass, and an inadvertent irony crept into that website when there was an advertisement for a brokerage that was offering to sell yachts. So as you were scrolling through the photos of the happy citizens of Donbass being liberated, you could also potentially target someone who might help you get rid of a yacht that has suddenly become inconvenient to own.
Right. Oh my gosh. Are there ways that people in Russia can get news from the West that, that Putin hasn't been able to stop?
Many of them have VPNs.
Yeah, many have VPNs, and many will also are actively trying to communicate with colleagues, with friends outside the country to get a different perspective on things. But I think the fundamental point here is that you have to work very hard to get this alternative view of things, whereas the official line, you don't have to work hard to get. It's not risky, it's omnipresent. So the question becomes, how many people is the official narrative reaching, as against how many people are non-approved narratives reaching? And I'm afraid that the majority of Russians are likely to be hearing the official story on this.
Yeah. And recent polls show that actually there's been an increase in support, just in beliefs and support for what Russia's doing, this special military operation, with very few casualties of any kind, the party line. So for now, I would say that this domination of the media is being successful, but people are, receiving phone calls from Ukrainians. There's a lot of relatives and friends among Russians and Ukrainians. And we hear the occasional, they don't believe it, but I'm sure many people are hearing this. And so the question is, how long will people buy this narrative? And you think about the Soviet past, and by, at a certain point in Soviet history, people, an awful lot of people just were very cynical about the official line. So, people will believe this for a time, but things are going to change rapidly with regard to the economy, and more information is going to trickle in. And so, I'm not very confident that they can maintain this belief in this party line for a very long time.
And I would add that an important factor to consider in trying to understand who is receiving these messages and are they buying them is generation. That it is the older Russians, the ones who lived through the Soviet Union, who experienced the chaos of the 1990s firsthand. They are the ones who tend to rely disproportionately on official state media sources for information. Among the younger generation, the television has been called for several decades the zomboyashik, or the zombie box in Russian.
And I think the other thing that I find just so interesting and also just so sad about the whole situation is younger Russians have so much to lose by what's happening in their country, so much to lose. So they're very motivated to know what's going on.
Yeah, and that generational divide also. I've not been in Russia since 2019, but even then it was observable, this kind of generational divide between an older generation, which, as Professor Kaminer says, is watching the official news and also has a pretty clear memory of the 1990s and tends to more readily buy the kind of Putin argument that, whatever else it might be right now, at least it's not the 1990s. There's a younger generation that is both more actively looking for different sources of information and no longer considers, just not the 1990s as the bar that they want to be clearing anymore.
Right.
They expect more.
Namarak, who's watching on YouTube, asks, do you think that a large amount of the support for Ukraine has come from the mass televising of the fight on social media? If so, do you have an idea why this did not occur when Russia invaded Crimea?
Well, let me just chime in on that. I think that I think that this is right. This is an invasion of a whole country, right in the heart of Europe, in Central Europe, certainly, and Eastern Europe. And it's so different than, and also there's casualties. There's been massive casualties. I think if Putin's initial idea had worked out, so he seizes control of Kiev very quickly, replaces the government, very few casualties, it's a done deal. You know, it's unclear how Europe would have responded, actually. I don't know if we would see the response, this unified, this incredible unified European response. But that's not what happened. We had this invasion, we have casualties. And so this is very different from Crimea, where there were no casualties. And it was really, there was a major naval fleet positioned in Crimea, Russian naval fleet. So there's a military presence already there. And then the Civil War, that's an interesting question. Why didn't Europe respond more then? And I think there you can make some good arguments that there's been some leadership changes in important countries, namely Germany. Yes. Also, it didn't seem like it was really threatening to the status quo in Europe, whereas this feels to Europeans like a very important threat to the status quo. And I think we have a really important change in leadership in Germany with Chancellor Merkel, who believed really strongly in trade relations with Russia. So she grew up in East Germany, she speaks Russian, German. Putin, of course, speaks fluent German too. So they were close associates. They had an ongoing relationship. And she probably rightly so, believes that trade does reduce the possibility of conflict. So that was a very important status quo in Europe. So she retired, and there was a couple beats, and then Chancellor Scholz basically is choosing a different path for Germany today. So I think this is just a very different kind of threat than Crimea, and I agree also, and I think also that these important changes in leadership do figure in there.
Katya, who's watching on Facebook, asks, what do you think about the country Georgia's role in this situation? Does Georgia have danger from Russia? Does Georgia, should they feel that Russia poses a danger for them? Well,
Russia did have a short war with Georgia, like a 5-day war in 2008, and they have supported separatists in 2 regions in Georgia, and they're still there. And interestingly, Georgia just made an official application to join the EU, I think yesterday or the day before. So yeah, I think just to suggest to the viewer, the Moldova is a very important country to look at right now. It's a former Soviet republic, very vulnerable, I think.
And the Baltic region as well, the Baltic states.
Baltics.
They're of course NATO members, so that raises the game to a new level. But I think they are also justified in feeling an existential threat from Putin's actions in Ukraine.
Kazakhstan and Finland as well. Although I think it's worth saying that despite the kind of on the conceptual level, and any kind of surrounding country that could plausibly be claimed as part of the Russian Empire, part of the Soviet Union, ought to be sweating it a little bit. On a practical level, though, the main thing that this has shown is the importance of making other alliances, and has also, given the level of forces that Russia has committed, even to this quagmire in Ukraine, the sort of implausibility of launching attacks on more neighbors at once. So in that sense, I think it's perhaps backfired. As much as there would be a conceptual fear, it's also backfired in some significant ways if the idea was to kind of get a friendlier attitude from other neighboring countries.
And the Russian military has performed so poorly.
Abominably.
It has really revealed the Russian military to be somewhat of a Potemkin military, which should hopefully give some of those nations feeling existential threats at least some comfort.
I feel like that's what a lot of people are very frustrated, because it feels like this is an attack on kind of the whole system of international order. Like if Russia succeeds in getting in conquering Ukraine, it kind of basically sends the message that unless you have nukes, you can kind of do whatever you want.
I think this, yes, taking that into consideration, certainly, but this is going to change the international order, I think. And I'm not the only one, obviously. I think it has really important implications for how countries are going to respond. Already, the European Union is changing so quickly from, I think that they're going to deepen integration. They're very likely to pursue, certainly individually and possibly as an entity, their own military. I think that this is just really highlighted to Europe how vulnerable they are militarily. And Russia has now behaved in a very different way. I mean, yes, of course, the Crimea, the separatists in Eastern Europe was interfering, but this is really orders of magnitude different. And I think watching the European Union country leaders, it's almost like it took them a couple beats and then they all just realized, oh my goodness, the implications for us are so enormous. So I think that it's going to have very important implications for the EU and then the role of the EU in the future. And of course, it's going to also have implications for Russia's pivot possibly away from the West. So this is what Chancellor Merkel so didn't want to have happen, is to sever trade relations. But this is another potential repercussion of this conflict.
The remilitarization of Germany, as my German husband has not tired of reminding me during the course of the past few weeks, this is a tectonic shift.
It is.
of immense magnitude.
William, who's watching on YouTube, asks, looking at the escalation of sanctions and pushback from European and Western nations, does Putin have an alternate path going forward for the de-escalation of this conflict?
I think he's in a really tough spot. I don't know what, everyone's speculating about Putin. I don't know what others want to, I mean, it's a new thing to speculate about what he's thinking. He's in a really tough spot. The question is he going to accept something where he gets some of his goals met and then can leave Ukraine as an independent state and leave their president in position? I don't know. I think it's very unclear what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think what will happen and the acceptability of off-ramps that may present themselves depends on the impact of these far-reaching sanctions, both on the kind of elite circles of the Russian Federation and also on among the population of the Russian Federation as well. I mean, we've already seen Russia's demands in terms of negotiations. They've climbed down a bit. They were extraordinarily high, but they're already a little bit less. Off ramps may look more plausible in the sense that I don't think we've ever seen sanctions cut this deep and affect this many economic sectors before. We don't know what's going to happen. And we also don't know exactly the effects that this may have on other countries, in kind of Eurasian political space, right? Which is to say, several other former Soviet republics, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Uzbekistan, are very closely tied economically to Russia. And, these are also countries who Putin might perhaps like to see as part of a Eurasian bloc. But, if that too is, if that relationship too becomes fraught, then off-ramps that he might not have considered a month ago might start to look more appealing. But we don't know. He also might see that there's, not a good off-ramp at all and dig his heels in more. This is hard to predict.
Very hard.
So do you think as the economic sanctions trickle down to the Russian people, they start noticing that Starbucks is closed, McDonald's is, closed, they can't get their Coca-Cola? Do you think that will kind of, they might start wondering like what's going on? Like maybe there's something that's happening that we're not getting on Russian TV?
I think that's already starting to happen. You've seen an immigration wave pick up over the course of the past, 7 to 14 days. You've seen, major prominent cultural figures emigrate. I guess the question is, what will ordinary Russians be able to do? Even those who maybe see what is happening and can only foresee a very grim and bleak future for themselves if they remain in Russia, and they want to emigrate. Well, what can they do when they cannot retrieve their funds because Visa and MasterCard don't work outside of Russia anymore. So it's very difficult to predict what actions Russians who see the situation clearly and understand the full gravity of it, what recourse will be available to them precisely as a result of those Western sanctions, which of course is the irony of them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things here. One is that, I'd say three things, I guess. One is that Professor Kaminer is right. It's very difficult, to know what the move will be from awareness of the situation to being able to do something about it. But I think it's worth emphasizing in general. Sometimes Americans are surprised by this, that the standard of living in Russia, especially in cities, has been relatively high, and that's actually been, one of the sources of Putin's legitimacy. And people have the ability to be aware of how others are living, and they aspire to that, and that's going away. And even if folks might not have an accurate understanding of what the war is, they might still find the situation to be unacceptable. We don't know what will happen there. I mean, the other thing, I want to be clear that this is rank speculation on my part. Like, we've already seen the abominable performance of the Russian army. There are these repressive laws. How long is it going to be possible to pay the police?
Yeah.
What happens if they're not getting paid? Or what happens if too many people in the army are kind of saying, well, okay, this is not what we were sold, and this is a bad situation. We can't predict what will happen, but there are any number of kind of long tail effects the sanctions could have that could be extremely dangerous for Putin.
And I think that the response of the population, it has to be linked to what elites are going to do. And I think there's a lot of talk about who the elites are, and this discussion of the oligarchs. And I think it's actually the case that the oligarchs don't have the kind of power that economic oligarchs like Zuckerberg or Musk or whomever in the United States would have. These guys have a lot of independent power, and these oligarchs don't. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're really trying to understand is how the military elite and the security elite are responding to this. And I think if they control the use of force, they're very, very powerful and have acted on Putin's behalf many times. And so I think that following that is also really clear. And it's, something really catastrophic could happen if you have a dovetailing of elite abandonment and especially the security elite and in fairly large popular disapproval too.
I was going to ask whether or not there was maybe some sort of realistic, semi-realistic scenario where the military could say, okay, this is insane, or there's some sort of grassroots upswelling from the people who don't want to deal with those sanctions anymore, and then learn that, what's actually going on in Ukraine. Is that even a possibility that, he could be just toppled from,
No.
From below?
I really don't think so. I think that it's going to require the elite, the security elite in particular, to start to have divisions within their ranks so that at least some of them start abandoning him. Without that, his control over the repressive organs of the state is so complete. And look how long Lukashenko has lasted in Belarus, and he's extremely unpopular. So I don't think just mass uprising will topple him.
Yeah, and you have to combine that too with, again, the kind of hollowing out of political alternatives who around whom popular support could coalesce. Professor Kaminer has already spoken about Navalny's prison term right now, and so that's also a necessary condition, a popular support in a popular movement in favor of something. And right now, it is difficult to see around whom that support would form.
And I think the Belarus. Go ahead. The Belarus
so we have another question. Alexandra from YouTube writes, she asks, who in your estimation is most likely to replace Putin, and what do you foresee as a reasonable expectation for transition of power in terms of timelines, likelihood of peaceful transition, etc.? Is there anybody in the wings? I mean, I guess, Navalny is in prison. Are there any people who could possibly, take him on? Sounds like not.
Well, I mean, if the head of one of the security agencies, there's three really important ones. had a strong backing and a bunch, then one could imagine some kind of coup happening. But then the question is, could that person lead? I'm extremely doubtful that they could lead. They would have no public support at all, no residual public support like Putin has with the older generation, no popularity. I can't imagine how they would lead. And they know that. I would assume they know that, that they know they're not popular at all. And the oligarchs are not popular. Maybe a military general, but the Russian military just doesn't have a tradition of involving itself in these political types of activities, at least not alone.
So I guess to wrap up, what do you think are some possible scenarios about of how this could end? I mean, I know it's a quickly changing story from hour to hour, but does the West wait out on sanctions? Do the sanctions work? Does the West somehow send air support in some fashion? Does Putin overwhelm the Ukrainian army? I mean, what are at this point? I mean, we're talking now on Wednesday, March 9th, 2022, and things are changing quickly. But right now, today, what do you think? Where are we heading with this war?
Well, I would say that one of my colleagues, Zev Mao's, a true expert on war, predicts that Putin will prevail and will take over some aspect of Ukrainian power, whether that means Kiev or part of the east, but there will be some kind of armed insurgent response that could be ongoing. And if the West continues to support that militarily, then I think that you could look at a long kind of confrontation, maybe not that dissimilar to what the US faced in Iraq. It wasn't that hard for the US to take control of the levers of governmental power in Iraq, but then to hold the country, that's what most of the military strategists that I read about are talking about, is how are they going to hold that country?
Mm-hmm. Because my concern would be that Putin cannot envision a way to resolve this conflict, given how vulnerable the Russian military has revealed itself to be, that he needs to somehow assert military superiority. And if that involves shelling cities, if that involves a long, grinding, brutal, Grozny, Chechen style assault, then I'm afraid that he's willing to pay the price to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly that's on the map of plausible outcomes, and it would be one of the worst ones. It does seem to me that there's essentially a kind of a race happening right now that the kind of sudden victory welcomed as liberators thing has not actually occurred. It's essentially a race between when tanks can get moving again, when air superiority might be established on the Russian side of things, as against when can the kind of deep cutting sanctions and the attendant supply issues with them have a really thoroughgoing effect. It's possible. I think there does exist a world in which Putin sees an on-ramp, an off-ramp rather, if the effects of sanctions become serious enough before the kind of victory scenario he would have envisioned. I
really feel that I think it would be very challenging for Europe to observe the kind of destruction that you're talking about, Jenny, with regard to a Grozny type of. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I have a lot of doubts that Europe would sit aside, and that wouldn't, in fact, lead to some kind of a much greater conflict.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's the other very scary scenario that lurks in the background, is that either consciously or inadvertently, NATO is pulled into this conflict and it escalates into something of an order of magnitude more frightening.
It's just hard to imagine public opinion in European countries and the US being able to tolerate that right now. Mm-hmm. I worry that if Zelensky is assassinated, how that will respond, how public opinion will respond.
Right.
In the West.
Very scary scenarios, but hopefully, things will take a turn for the better. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to give us context and historical background on this horrible, devastating war. Josephine Andrews is an associate professor of political science. Ian Campbell is an associate professor of history. And Jenny Kaminer is an associate professor in the Department of German and Russian here at UC Davis. I'd like to thank everybody who sent in questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to all of them, but thank you so much for doing that. On the next UC Davis Live, as UC Davis celebrates Biodiversity Museum Day this month, we'll hear from 3 curators on how the museum's unique collection of bugs, plants, and yeasts support research and teaching. That's coming up on Thursday, March 31st. I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is UC Davis Live.